All right, let me get back to the page. There we go. Hi, it's Sarith Ken from Ontario, and I'm here with Duke Brion of Tarragon, who lives in the East right now, but used to live in Aytonville and Artemisia. And I have a special guest host today, Sir Kelwin from Artemisia. And I'm super excited to talk to Brion. I've heard tons of stories about him from Sean, and I got to meet him a couple years ago at Adult Swim. So usually, well, why don't I actually give you a little bit more of an intro? Like, I actually went through a couple of orders of presidents today, looking you up, and you've reigned 8 times in Aytonville. 5 of them were in a row, and then 3 times in the East, and your reigns have spanned 30 years, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, so we were talking about a little bit before we went live. That's super impressive. Like, to keep your prowess up at a level where you can win crown for 30 years is, I mean, it's just kind of mind-boggling to me. So awesome. So that's who we're talking to today. So let's, we usually start these with sort of your origin story. So if you can tell us how you found the SCA and when and where, that would be great.
Sure, and thank you for asking me to sit down with you guys this evening and everything. I guess the origin was my cousin had called me when I was in high school, and at the time I had been fencing and doing some things at the University of Utah. At that point in time, very interested in sword fighting, but it was from a theatrical basis, and then got into the fighting, and it sounded fun, and always wanted to be a knight, dreamed of being a knight. You know, brother and I would get shields and mock swords and hit each other. And my cousin called up and said, "You got to come up to the university. There's these guys, and they're beating the hell out of each other with sticks." And I thought, oh, it must be just a couple of, you know, university students just kind of playing around. And went up to the naval center that's up there, and Naval Sciences Building, that was what it was called. And pretty amazed when I saw, at the time, I was about 17 years old at the time, a couple of older gentlemen at the time, felt like considerably older than myself, beating the hell out of each other in armor, and having a great time doing it. And I have to say, going and watching it, I kind of got hooked right away in terms of, it sounded like an interesting experience and something that might be fun to try out. You know, and at that point in time, I was 17. I had some things going on with finishing school, and was pretty involved in my senior year in high school, and decided to, while I was in school, build some armor so that next summer, when I was able to come to fighter practice, I would actually be fully armored. And actually built a suit of plate armor. Looked horrible, but was a good start, and was able to show up that next summer right after I turned 18, and that's when I started fighting at Sugar House Park in Salt Lake City, Barony of Loch Salon. Hey, everybody.
So did you just teach yourself how to make plate armor then?
That first suit, yeah. The first suit, and I'm not even going to call it a suit. It was kind of a hodgepodge bunch of flat steel bent and welded together, but as best as I could kind of come up with a recreation of what I thought it would, you know, be to be able to start the fighting. It was horrifically heavy. You know, just a tremendous amount of extra material that I didn't know what I was doing with. Pop rivets, and what wasn't so good, let's say, but it, you know, a good start. And, you know, I like to tell a lot of people, especially those that have started the SCA in the last 10, 15 years, you know, the world back when it started, you couldn't buy the stuff. You know, everything was, you either found somebody to make it for you, or you learned to make it for you. And that was actually part of coming up in the society, particularly in the barony. Something that I appreciated very much was you learned how to build the armor, how to take care of the armor before you could even fight in the armor. And I appreciated the fact that that was part of the process. Yeah, that was the beginning.
What did you do about a helmet? How did you satisfy that part?
Well, I found out about, at the time, you could use an army pot. And so it was a cut off army pot that we welded. And my father helped with part of this. And then a friend of mine, his father who could weld, helped us with another part of it. But effectively, we just attached some additional steel to this army pot and created a closed helm. And that was the start. I learned very, very quickly afterward. It was right about that time. They actually they said that was no good, too thin. I actually still have a version of the helmet that we recreated into a bassinet. And it's just hilarious to look at these days, because it's got 1-2 inch dents in it from where it was struck, and we reinforced it with additional metal. But at the time, who knew?
Right. So, who did you start training with when you first started?
Well, I would say the first person that taught me how to throw a sword shot was William Gallaglass. He was doing some of the training up at Sugar House Park, and had the Pell out, and anybody that wanted to pick up a stick and learn how to throw a shot, he was given lessons. I'd say that was the beginning of learning how to throw a flat snap. After that, there were quite a few individuals that were good initial instructors and teachers of mine. I first squired to Anton Hoyen, who lives out in the West Kingdom now. And after Anton left, I then squired and finished my training with Robert Dispenser. And from both Robert and Anton, I learned various things. But I'd say very, very early on, the one thing that I learned, and I think this is the one thing that does help a beginning fighter really start to excel, is you really have to open yourself up to a very wide variety of individuals, and be very, very open to listening to what they have to say, but also how they're actually going about the task. Now, it doesn't mean that it's all right. It doesn't mean that it's all correct. It also doesn't mean that it's always going to be the best. But early on in my training, I tried to really open up to practically everyone that was fighting at that time. And in the barony, it was Bogar, it was Kveldov was a big, big help, particularly in learning some things about strength and speed early on. And from the different people, you gain a perspective. And certainly over time, the biggest thing was then learning how to travel.
Right, because at the time, Artemisia, what is now currently Artemisia, was part of Atenvelt, correct?
It was. So Atenvelt at that time was effectively all of what is now the Outlands, Atenvelt, and all of Artemisia, and went from Canadian border to the Mexican border.
Enormous kingdom.
It was, and very spread out.
So where would you have to travel to fight the people that were like the top caliber fighters at the time?
So I love to talk about this time, because I also think it was one of the things that made coming up in the SCA at the time that I came up a very special thing, because the barony in Loch Solon was very, in consideration of what it's grown to today, it was very somewhat sequestered. It was the barony itself and the group there. And anytime you wanted to play with somebody else, you could go to Otherhill, which was about the closest group that was near to us. But if you wanted to go to a barony, the next closest barony was to go to Kerta over in Denver, or to go to down to Phoenix, or go down to Albuquerque. And Albuquerque was 14 to 15 hours. So if you wanted to learn or train or work out with some of the better fighters, it was going to be a 10 to 12 hour drive to do that. And we did that pretty regularly.
And how long were you squired to Robert Dispenser for before you got knighted?
I started fighting when I was 18, and I was squired to Robert for about a year, a little over a year and a half. And then I was knighted when I was 20. And so it was about better part of about a year and a half. I was squired to Sir Robert.
And while you were squired, how often did you travel that 8 to 12 hours to seek out the really good fighters?
I have to say, my heavy travel didn't start until after that point in time. We traveled quite a bit. I would say some of those trips you would go at least once a month. You were traveling somewhere. And of course, there were things that were local, but to get to those other places and meet and visit other people, you were traveling, once a month, once every couple of months. So it wasn't as much at that point in time. And I do think that's one thing I'd share with you is I won my first crown soon thereafter. And at that point, I was 20 years old and, feeling really great, and, thought that I was really, getting on top of this game. And it was at that point that my eyes were opened up the first time we traveled out to Penzic, because that first Penzic War, I was introduced to several fighters who were exceptional. And it very quickly realized there's a whole other level of learning that you can have on a much wider basis, working out with a lot of people from other areas. And it was about that point in time where we would spend a lot of time. Trelon and I became good friends, and we'd travel down to visit quite often. Making the trip down to Phoenix actually was kind of funny, because we would, we'd take off, head down to Phoenix, and then fight for 2 days and head home before work on Monday. That's really where the real heavy training began.
I think I might have some pictures. Like I think I have one of your first coronation, but let me see if I can.
So at your local practice, so when you first started out, how many fighters did you actually have?
I'd say that there were, at any point in time, maybe between 10, oh my God. There were maybe between 10 and 15 to 20, depending upon what was going on. There was always a big push for the war, getting ready for Burrow Creek at the time, which eventually became, Great Desert, and then turned into Estrella. But at that period of time, as we were preparing and getting close to the war, we'd end up, getting more and more fighters out. And of course, Shield Wall was a big deal, and practicing, being together, and the unit being together for the war. But it was, in any given period of time, we could have as few as 4 or 5 fighters showing up to practice on a regular basis. And that wasn't an unusual number. The thing I would say is that the 4 or 5 that would show up were very dedicated. It was about that time where, I would say, as I was coming right out of, getting knighted and moving into that period of time, it wasn't unusual to be practicing 2 to 3 times a week, and then going to an event on the weekends. And the events back then were usually 2 days. So you would have the event and some fighting on Saturday, and there would still be another portion of the event and fighting on Sunday before you left to go home. And that was a fairly normal kind of a week to have 4 to 5 practices that you could be working on various things.
Just in your local area? Because I mean, that would mean basically that everybody there was really interested in getting good, right?
Well, I would say the folks that started to show to practice on a fairly regular basis, I would say yes, very much so. We're trying to actually increase their their craft and become better at what they were learning. I believed very early on in a couple of basic philosophies. One was starts with defense. I know a lot of people start with offense and throwing shots, and that's an important aspect of it. But my style, where I really went, was it starts with defense and defending and being able to be extremely effective at that end of the game. And that allows you then to develop your sword work and other things that you're trying to do. But the people that were showing up to practice were all, I would say, very much wanting to become better. And so, Sean, Thorfinn, Shannon, I keep going down the list of individuals that would show up, but we had fairly regular attendance of people who were interested in gaining skill and then carrying it forward. And that then started to translate into people who were coming from the outside down to practice. Alan Young Forrest and others would come down to practice, and God bless them, they'd take a 3-4 hour trip just to come down to fight. But they started doing it on a fairly regular basis to come down and participate in the practice itself. And I think that had an impact overall. Decker started to come down for practices, and when he could, various people would show up, and it would increase the number of people participating and the strength of the practice.
And back in that time period, were you doing like different kinds of drills and stuff to hone your defense in addition to fighting?
Yeah, I'd say, one of the things that early on, I kind of find it a bit funny when I think back upon it, because I didn't do a lot of Pell work. Pell work is something that I think is very effective. I think a lot of people put a lot of good practice into training with a Pell. The reason I didn't do a lot of Pell work was I always felt like an actual physical confrontation with somebody was having a live Pell was the better way to go. And so we tended to run our practices where we could spend extended periods of time with one individual one-on-one working on things. And it was less about trying to do very quick bullpit type of exercises and more about working on precision and things that we would work one-on-one against another individual. You might be trying a specific style, you might be trying a specific shot, you might be trying specific defense, and working that through for prolonged periods of time, 20, 30-minute type of encounters, and then move on to the next person at that point in time. And I do think that helped to hone some things. I would say the other thing is, when I started fighting, there were some very basic things that had been figured out by that point in time. I know you interviewed Duke Paul recently, and obviously Paul and the flat snap and some of the precision that he brought, that set a base that we started to work from. But as I was kind of coming up, there were a couple of other things that were starting to come into play. One of which was Christopher of Houghton tore apart a crown list in Atenveldt using a hanging sword style, front guard hanging sword style. that frankly nobody, at least in that crown, had seen before. And he just ripped through everybody because of his ability to hit that offside, and the fact that the sword was ahead. He had so much more speed than anybody else. Immediately, of course, everybody was like, "Oh, we got to try this, and we got to start using this kind of a style." Shortly thereafter, Duke Torgel from up in Ontier wrecked everybody at 20 year. And he was using forward foot style. These were new things that I'm sure others will say, "Oh, well, I've seen that before. I saw that." At that point in time, they were fairly new, and they were at least in an expert level of somebody using them against, a crowd. These were things that were pretty game changing at different events that I attended. And it was through absorbing all of these things that were going on at the time. It made for a very interesting evolution of the SCA and the SCA fighting through this, 80s, and really carried into the 90s time period.
Was there anything that you added to that evolution? Like, was there a Tarragon move? I don't know.
I will tell you, I've thought about this over the years, and I actually think the thing that made me able to do what I learned to do was I tried to be as much of a sponge as I possibly could, and absorb as much information and as much as I could from the different people that I was learning from. Because I will tell you, I learned speed from Trelon. I learned power from Michael of Bedford. I learned the ability to bend from Torquil up in Ontier. And
it's still bendy, by the way.
But the thing that when I say I learned these things from them is, I always pictured in my mind, as I was trying to learn a new shot, or as I was trying to learn a new defense, or as I was trying to mimic what I was seeing that was working. And I would try to, within the capacity of my body, to allow me to do that similar thing. I tried to allow myself to actually mimic what I was seeing these other fighters do. And spent a lot of time at a lot of practices effectively using their style as best I could. And I say that with all humbleness in terms of as best I could, because the reality is I also recognized my own weaknesses, where it was, I might not be the fastest, I might not be the strongest, I might not be the most bendy. But what I could do is I could combine the things together, and through a lot of practice, and that's why I brought up earlier, I think one of the most important things for fighters to realize is you will get out of this sport whatever you put into it. You have to give it your all. And in reality, during the first 10 years that I fought, once I started going to fighter practice, I didn't miss a single Wednesday night fighter practice for the first 10 years that I fought. I didn't miss a single one. And the thing about that I think is important is that many of you probably know I spent a lot of time learning how to train horses and riding. There's a saying in the equestrian world, butt and saddle time. And it basically just translates into hours in the saddle, hours throwing shots, hours doing whatever activity you love to do, golf, whatever it is. That if you perfect practice makes perfect. And if you practice enough, it will start to lock in muscle memory, and it'll start to lock in things that you can then use very effectively. But you can't just fake it, and you can't just come out there and say, okay, I'm just gonna show up with this and it's gonna be good, because it rarely will.
So I was gonna ask you, one of the things I remember from my early days when you were still in the kingdom is how patient of a fighter you were. Who did you learn your patience from? How did you get to that point where you just waited and then acted? Because you always were so conservative in your energy because of the patients.
So I figured out very early on that, and this is, I think, a little bit why I tend towards teaching and learning and thinking defense is an important aspect to the whole thing. Um, I personally believe the fighters that I'm going to fight are going to be faster than I am. Now they may or they may not, but I'm just going to assume that. But the one thing I know I can do is I can very likely block a shot a lot easier and a lot faster and counterpunch into whatever they're coming at me with in an effective way. And I would say to do that, you have to be patient. You have to be patient. You have to allow the other individual to make a mistake. And once you hit a point where these things really start to come together, then everything is effectively, you're setting your opponent up so that when you deliver your blow, it's going to be on a 90-degree angle with full force. And it gives you an advantage in terms of how you hit. I've had a lot of people tell me over the years, wow, you're so fast. I say it's not as it's reasonably fast. It's not as fast as some, but if I can hit you hard and I can hit you solid, and I can make sure that I hit you on a 90-degree angle, and I can set you up where you're standing flat-footed while I do it, it all comes together. So patience is one. I'd say the other thing, and this is, shout out to everybody in Artemisia, you learn to fight a little differently when you're at 4,000 feet and playing sometimes at 8,000 feet, 7,000 feet when you go to some events. It's a different game when you're dealing with altitude. And, for some of us who may not have the easiest time breathing, it is one of those things that, it's adaptation to the surroundings so that you can be the best you can be.
So you won your first crown like a year after you were knighted. Did you make any sort of metamorphosis or change in your training or your style to get ready to win crown?
Yeah, I'd say I wouldn't call it a metamorphosis. I would say there was a lot of steady practicing, trying to get better, trying to learn different forms. One of the things I always appreciated very much about Sir Robert was he always told me, a gentleman should be able to pick up anything and defend themselves and fight well with it. And he meant like literally anything. You should be able, if you're in a bad situation, you should be able to pick up a chair and do something with it. So he was always very, very open to other weapons forms and styles. And so we regularly practice with a wide variety of weapons. And by learning the weapons forms, you also gain knowledge of how to beat the weapon forms. I would say the biggest change for me came shortly thereafter, where it was really after that first crown, it was fighting some of these other individuals at Penzik and at Estrella and some of the other practices that started to creep up. All of a sudden, the bar kept going up, and it was a great thing to chase. And so what that meant was just more time. I'm sure Sean has probably regaled you of some of the early practices and some of the one-off practices that we did in training. And some of the exercises were cardio. One I love is knee to knee, either kneeling or standing up, but knee to knee, and you just go. And after you're done, about 10 minutes later, then you can talk about all the shots and what happened. But the entire intent is just go for broke and throw as much and hit as much as you can to work the muscles, work your style, work your angles. but do it in a way that forces the effort. That was one thing that we did on a fairly regular basis. The other things that we would spend a lot of time on were you have to have a mentality when you're fighting in tournaments. And I love tournaments. I mean, to me, it's like I know a lot of people love different aspects of the overall experience. And to me, the tournaments were always the thing. And the ability to get through a tournament, there's an art to it. And it has a lot to do mentally as well as physically.
And how did you train that?
Well, I think some of it is this will sound overly simplistic, but it's like participate, show up, get there and do the tournaments, be a part of it. I'd say the second part is taking constructive criticism and trying new things, even when it's uncomfortable. I think that's a part that a lot of people have difficulty with is you can say you're listening, but are you really taking it in? Are you really attempting to make the change or the adjustment? And then I'd say probably the third thing is having an ability to adapt to what you are capable of. And I think that comes back around to what we were talking about earlier, in that everybody's body is different and at a different level of fitness. And I also think that there are aspects of you might have injuries or physical issues or things like that that you have to learn to be able to incorporate and deal with. And if you can't do that, if you cannot figure those things out, if you cannot make your way around them, they can be a big, kind of a big impedance in how you're going to actually progress. So I think the training, the mental side comes from you've got to do it a lot, because that nervousness, that adrenaline kick that you get when you start to fight or when you start throwing shots. I remember times just thinking about fighting would start the adrenaline pumping. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so being able to control that, I tell fighters all the time, breathe. Think of how many times you've gotten in a fight with somebody else and either you or that other individual, you recognize that they're not breathing, and how important it is to be able to maintain a level of focus and relaxation as you're going through this process. And I'd say that probably also plays into why I found that playing a counterpunch style worked well for me, because it would keep me from getting overly exhausted, or I'd love it when the guys who'd throw combos, fine, let them throw their 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 shot combo. And especially when we were at high altitude, about that point, then you could kind of come with the thunder. So
do you have a tourney day ritual? Or
I would say, yeah, a little bit. One of the things I always like to do is, I think it's more mental than anything else, but I'm always very interested in the footing in the list field, knowing where the holes are, knowing where, I'd usually walk the field pretty carefully and understand exactly how much room I would have in each of the lists, how much space was available, what I needed to do in terms of, directions to face and things of this sort, just to better understand what it was going to be. But I think some of that also was, for me, it also allowed for some calming while the activity was going on.
What role does your consort play on Tourney Day?
I would say that is the center of all of it. I've been very, very fortunate, and many of you know Anna, and have had the pleasure of spending some time with her. Um, I felt myself and counted myself very, very lucky to be able to have somebody that I can fight for um, in these crowns, and that not only provides me the inspiration, but knowing when we, because the ultimate thing, it's fun to fight, it's fun to win, but once you've won, you got a job to do, and we've been lucky. We've been able to play that role a few times. Um, Having somebody by your side while you're doing that, you not only trust but you love, to be able to share that with you is really special, and it's a big part of it. I do think that when we think about the SCA and we think about the whole idea of what we as knights and chivalry are doing, those that inspire us are crucial to all of it. It's a shared experience, and it's something that I think attracted me into the SCA. It's probably one of the most central parts of why I think it's a special activity to do.
You reigned in Atenvelt basically 5 times in a row. That gave you a really big opportunity to sort of shape culture there. And I just kind of wonder, what are some of the things that you did there to like leave a mark, and what's your favorite tradition in Atenvelt?
A lot of that has to do with the time period, and kind of what was going on. Also, being younger and being able to dedicate, pretty much almost 100% to participating was what allowed me to go ahead and do the 5 in a row. And it did have a chance to impact the culture. But part of that was somewhat purposeful because, just a little bit of way back machine in history. Anna always likes to say it's kind of very odd for her personally, because the first thing she did as queen was break up a kingdom, and the last thing she did as a queen while she was in Atenvelt was break up a kingdom. And what that has to do with is, during my first reign, the Outlands was already starting the process of breaking from becoming from being a principality to becoming a kingdom. And it was during our reign that we stepped up, went to the Outlands, and they held their crown tournament and crowned their first king. So the way the kingdom split caused it was an interesting geographical challenge, because for those of you that were around at the time, Atenvelt still stayed from the Mexican border to the Canadian border in terms of length. And so the travel, the distances, everything that needed to be done to actually see that kingdom was still fairly daunting in terms of travel time. And the groups were very diverse population-wise. So Trelon, who was down in Phoenix, he and I traded the crown 3 times. And then I went an additional crown after that. And in doing that, it did create a level of stability in terms of some of the traditions, some of the ways we were able to kind of encourage travel and get people to start to interact and work together as a kingdom. I felt, at least at the time, was very, very important in terms of keeping the kingdom going and allowing it to evolve the way that it did. Because it was, the kingdom was extremely spread out. I mean, just at the end of the day, I remember many times the push was always, could we get people to travel down and meet and intermingle with the other parts of the kingdom, just because the distances were just so significant. And I think at the time it worked. We got a lot of people working with one another, intermingling. It was during this time that a number of the folks within Artemisia were enhancing their skills to where they could start taking on and moving into the roles that they would start to take on soon thereafter. And that did encourage and help things to grow. But I'd say that was a big deal, kind of keeping things stable at the time. Thinking of traditions, it's a bit funny, but I do think one of the things that I do miss from time to time was knightings back then were a little less ceremonial than they are today. Not that, there's anything wrong with pomp and circumstance and ceremonies and everything, but I would say there were some really special kind of knightings on the field and things that happened at the war and stuff that was a little bit more impromptu, that with all the planning and process that kind of exists today, that aspect of the tradition was, I kind of miss that a little bit from time to time, because it was just a little bit more exciting. You were a little bit more in the minute as decisions were made and things occurred and stuff happened. And that wasn't just with knightings, that was with other orders as well, but it was just a little bit more impromptu. Made it feel like you were living it a little bit more.
Was your knighting impromptu?
Wasn't completely impromptu. I was the crown tourney before the first one that I won. I was competing in that crown tournament, and it was at that crown tournament that I was pulled aside and then told I was going to be knighted, and then I was knighted at that court that evening. My obviously those around me knew, or my knight knew and his lady knew, but it wasn't just a grab, but it was fairly impromptu.
What about you're also a laurel and a pelican, correct?
I am.
What about those? Were those impromptu?
Yeah, they were impromptu in that, we didn't do writs back then, or, like we'll do this at the next event. These were generally, you didn't know it was going to happen, or what was going to happen, unless somebody chose to tell you as such, and then it would actually occur. So somewhat impromptu, I'd say, for the other two as well.
Kellen, did you have a question?
I wanted to get back to when you were talking about the length of the kingdom, and when after Outland split, is that when Artemisia became a region? And were you actively involved in that whole process of creating the region and later on the principality?
Yeah, we were active in participating and supporting what was going on with the region and the principality. The region, a lot of the region came into play during this time, while those reigns were going on. There was a lot of work being done within Artemisia to help just foster the identity of what used to be part of the Outlands. So, and I do think that was a very important part of creating not only an entity within the and an identity for everybody, but I also think that there was an established principality of the sun that was already in place. And so I think there was almost a feeling within the group of wanting to grow to the point where it became its own principality. But there was also a lot of very new groups that were springing up all over the place at the time. I mean, it in a period of, I'd say, it seemed like, maybe wrong here, but it seemed like to me, within a period of about 10 years, we suddenly had a fair number of shires. Several of the groups turned into baronies, and all of a sudden, Artemisia was starting to really grow in terms of just the number of people. And that was part of the issue up front, was that you needed to have enough people to really justify being a principality. And it was one of those things where we didn't want to just barely get to the number. You wanted to have enough to sustain it and continue to justify being that kind of an entity within the SCA. So there was a lot going on then. The heraldry, coming up with things to really say something about the principality and what it would become.
So were you actively involved with the naming?
No. The name actually, before I even began to play, there was the Artemisian Games, and you'll have to ask Robert and Leah and others about the origin of that particular item in terms of the original name. What was very much set was we were going to be Artemisia. I don't recall it being much of a debate in terms of the name. What it was really about more was just starting to establish some tradition that became, what was going to become the principality and later the kingdom.
So it's totally coincidental that Tarragon is also in the Artemisia family.
It is completely coincidental about that. Yeah. It was very, I always laughed after the fact because Tarragon, one translation of it is Little Dragon of Artemisia. Mm-hmm. And so I always laughed a little bit about that because that was not intentional.
That's pretty cool though.
It is, because Draconius, Artemisia Draconius, and then you have the dragons on your shield and everything. So pretty cool. So how did you feel? Because you started out, you were a big part of Artemisia and us coming up and becoming a principality. And one of your squires was the first prince of Artemisia. That had to have been a really great feeling.
Yeah, when Thorfinn became prince, I was on the throne at the time, and it was very, very exciting to see. It was also it was something that we just were very, very proud that we were able to get the recognition for Artemisia and the folks in Artemisia on a very regular basis. I mean, that was something that was very, very important to me because in growing up, there weren't, early on, there were no kings from Artemisia or in Artemisia. It was one of these things where when you talked about the crown, it was always with this pointer down to the barony of Atenveldt in the south, or Alberon. But it never was really up here. And so that was something that I think it was very important to me just personally, that we were able to kind of get our fair share of attention. And that came as everybody was able to kind of step up into various roles. Suddenly, a lot of kingdom officers certainly individuals were able to move into more and more positions that could help influence the broader kingdom. And I thought that was a great thing to see evolve.
So you were king 4 or 5 times, and then you decided to compete in the coronet list for Artemisia. Was there any particular reason why you decided to do that after being king for 4 or 5 times?
Anna's sitting back here laughing. Yeah, so we were. I think it was after the 6th reign. I decided to compete in a coronet list, and it was a bit of a spur of the moment decision to participate, and we. I'm very, very glad I was able to be a prince of Artemisia. It's very special to me, but it wasn't something that was really greatly well planned out. We just said, "Oh, let's go. There's a tournament. Let's go participate in the tournament." And I happened to be on the better end of the fighting that day.
I guess that's one way of putting it.
Anna likes to tell the story that I came to her as we were going into the finals, and I looked at her and I said, "Hun, I think we got a little problem here." I think I got us in a bit of a situation, are the exact words.
So you've also reigned 3 times in the East. What's the difference between crown tournaments in the East and Atenvelt, and what's the difference for you in reigning in the 2 different kingdoms?
You know, very different kingdoms, and very different in terms of population, traditions, various things, and yet similarities. Very strong attention to the arts within the East. I think that our kingdom here has some of the most beautiful scrolls and calligraphy that you'll find in the entire known world, as well as many other great arts that the people out here produce. I would say the biggest thing from a tournament perspective is the tournaments up until I moved into the East were very much usually a double elimination, single fight, sometimes 2 out of 3, but oftentimes single fight, double elimination, straight through tournament was the way that they were fought. And there's, a certain way you fight that style of a tournament. In coming out into the East early on, that's where my reign started to spread out a bit, because we won fairly quick after we had moved here. And this is about 23 years ago. And at that point, it was still, single fight, double limb. But the one thing that the East has always done is they've sometimes in their semifinal, but always in their final. The final's always best 3 out of 5, multiple weapons. And every once in a while it gets changed up a little bit, but most of the time it's best 3 out of 5, multiple weapons. And that does change things a little bit in terms of the way the tournament ends at times. That sometimes I've seen carried into the semifinal for some of the bouts, but that was a little bit of a difference. Later, the change that occurred within some of the tournament formats, where it started going into pools and then getting into other forms. The one thing that's always stuck is that end battle of best 3 out of 5, that's I think it adds another flavor to the fight. Each is allowed to call what form they want to use and any specifics around it. The last crown I won, my last weapons form, I fought single sword, no thrusting. And so it makes for a different kind of a fight, but it allows you to look at different things and different styles and really, show what you're capable of in more than just a single style.
Do you think culturally that type of final has evolved in the East because of the emphasis on Penzik and war and, and being proficient in multiple weapons forms?
I'd say yes. I would say yes. I would also say there's a history in the East of fighters like Duke Visivald, who you know, is known for his pole armsmanship, and others. You know, Duke Balfour is a two-sword fighter. Many of our fighters are very proficient. Duke Gregor, expert two-handed swordsman, very, very proficient in other forms. And so I think maybe a little bit chicken and the egg, you know, people become more proficient in these other forms because they had to excel, or, you know, or, you know, was it that, you know, this just format created that? I don't know. But I do think it's something that, it was a little bit of a difference coming out here. The fact that it was a very pronounced, this is how you should do it. And certainly getting ready for Pennsic, you know, the war is an incredibly important part of the culture in the East. And that kind of translates into a lot more war-related activity practices compared to tournaments. Some of us have, you know, noticed at times, you know, there's virtually no tournaments. It's almost all war practice, but that's more cultural.
So how is reining different?
I would say it's not different. I would say what's different is culture, and I think this is really important. One of the things that you're always thinking of when you're reining is you need to be very, very attentive to the people that you are providing this show for, right? And there are certain cultural priorities and habits and things that are very, very important to the kingdom. And I think one of the big things that Anna and I did the very first reign we had out here was we held a peers circle very early on, and we're very open to everybody that we're new. You know, yes, we'd spent many, many years and many reigns out in Atenveld, but now we were Easterners. We needed to learn the East. And so, no, we were not here to turn the East into Atenveld. We wanted to learn how to be a king and queen of the East. And people helped us. I mean, we got a lot of very good advice and help. One of the things I was very grateful for, and this kind of comes back to the why should you travel? You should travel not only to meet great people and have the opportunity to do things and learn more, but also you never know where life's going to lead you. And one of the things that was really comforting, leaving our friends and family in Artemisia was very, very hard. It was helpful to have friends here to accept us coming into this community. And, you know, Duke Randall and Duke Gregor and Duke Balfour and Lucan and others who we knew out here, accepting us and welcoming us and helping us really made the transition a lot easier overall in terms of being able to rule out here.
So with all your reigns, what's your favorite thing about reigning? What do you like the most about it?
That's a great question. I tell people my persona in the SCA is a little weird compared to most, because I've had the fortune of being on the throne more than my fair share. And because of that, when people think about what's your persona, my association is very much with sitting a throne. More than half of my time in the SCA has been in that kind of a regard. So my favorite part of the entire thing, I'd say there's two favorites. One is, first and foremost, it's what we were talking about earlier. There is nothing better than the moment that you place that coronet on your consort's head. That to me is just as special a time as there can ever be. And naming your lady or lord, queen, or consort is just, to me, that's the most the biggest thing that you could ever experience. It's like getting married all over again. So it's an awesome feeling. So, you know, that's one part. The second part is, I think it's very, very fulfilling to hopefully put on a really entertaining, but a very respectful showing of what your interpretation of being a king should be. And I think different people have different styles, different ways of going about it. I certainly have a very strong opinion of the way I think it should be. And I've tried to actually be that for everyone while I've been sitting the throne. And hopefully I've been able to make some people happy during that time because of the attention that I've put into it.
You were my first king, so, and I've not forgotten that. So that was over 30 years ago.
A little while ago.
Do you well, actually, can you tell me what your laurel was for? We didn't talk about that at all.
Yeah, so my laurel is kind of I think of it as a bit of a multi-task type of laurel. At the time, I was known for costuming, armoring, and woodworking, and I was doing all quite a bit. But it was costuming and armoring were the main items that I was given the laurel for.
Somebody, I can't remember if it was Timur or Sean, said something about like to be a squire in your lineage, you have to know how to sew or something. Is that right?
Well, I'll tell you. So my very first costume that I ever had, I wanted to make I think at the time it was a musketeer outfit, and my mother basically walked me in and said, "There's the sewing machine." So it was kind of like I said at the start of our conversation. Back in the day, using back in the day, you kind of had to figure it out, and part of that came through just learn through doing, ask questions, get a little help, and you might surprise yourself what you're capable of doing. So I think the connection between costuming and armoring had a fairly natural kind of a connection point, in that in both you are using a material to bring together something that hopefully in 3D is what you expected it to be. And I was able to kind of connect skills in both of those. But I also got a lot of help along the way. There were a lot of people who, were very willing to offer their suggestions and criticisms and critiques, and you figure it out.
Okay. Do you still look at knighthood or any of your peerages the same as you did back when you got them? Because it's been what, 20 years on most of them, at least.
It's been 30.
I didn't do the math. A while.
I'm pretty sure you had all three before I started in '89. So
I wrote it down.
That's right. It was I was knighted in '84. So I would say I'm humbled that folks at the time thought well enough of what I was doing to say they felt like it was worthy of their attention. it's it's a very interesting thing to me. Um, and this may sound a little bit controversial overall, but I've been a little bit bothered at the, in my opinion, almost over attention that awards have gotten within the society. Not that they're not important, because they are, and recognition's important. People like to be recognized. I like to be recognized. I'm sure you like to be recognized. But I also feel like there are times where it almost feels like it's kind of the end all be all of everything that's going on. And my question to you would be, what are you doing the activity for? Are you doing it because you love it? Are you doing it because you're enjoying it? You know, this is a part of your life. You know, you only get so many days on this earth to live. So if the activity you're doing is because you're learning something, you're thrilled, you're enjoying the company of others while you're doing it, if there's something like that, then great. If you're doing it just to get a pat on the back, there's a lot of ways to get pats on the back. And so I just, that's the one part of it that I sometimes think it could be, make sure you love it. And I can tell you from during the days when I was fighting the most, and growing up, my passion for fighting was complete. I found tremendous joy in it, and learned a lot, and grew a lot, and met a lot of neat people, and gained a lot of friendships, and all of those things. I mean, it made for a really, really good way to spend that precious spare time that we all have.
Yeah, we talk about it every once in a while that awards are like the best thing and the worst thing about the society, because people get so much of their self-worth wrapped up in whether they've gotten the thing or not, and you forget that it's really about the process, whatever it is, like your art, your fighting, whatever. It's about the process and finding your passion and following it. And if you get an award at the end of that, great. And if you don't, you still pursued your passion, right?
That's right. No, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I have to say, for me, the quest was always I wanted to be a knight, and it wasn't to be a king. It wasn't to be. Those came along over time, but even before I joined the SCA, I always wanted to be a knight. So
yeah,
to me, that was an achievement, something to shoot for, something to try to epitomize, that I think was worthy, and something that is inspiring for me personally.
Right. And that journey also never ends, right? I mean, you get the belt and chain, but you still every day are challenging yourself to be the best Misty or Brian or Kelwyn you can be, right? So that you still are knightly.
I think that's right, because I think that you're leading by example. You're playing a role, and that role, I think, can change people, and change their lives in terms of people that you meet in the SCA and abroad, because some of the simple things like courtesy and being willing to stand up and defend are important. And yeah, these are things that I do think that it allows you a real good avenue to be able to show it. And yeah, it doesn't end.
So on that note, what do you think the Order of Chivalry could improve upon collectively as an order?
I think that the order is very much a reflection of its members. But I also think that every generation has something to give to it, and also a responsibility for how it evolves. I've been fortunate to have been part of a number of decades, and I can tell you the chivalry that I came into, the heroes, the people that I looked up to, Duke Deaton Claymore, Dennis of the Titans, folks that were kind of the people that you kind of came in and looked up to at that point in time. They kind of created an aura for what knighthood was at that point in time. And then we added to that. And every knight that's been made since then has added to that. And so for you, it's now time to add to that. And I don't know that there is something I would say, this is something that the order needs to work on. I would say there's a challenge right now. and I do think that challenge is, continuing to attract people into fighting and participating and doing things. It's probably a little more challenged now than it ever has been. Just looking at the numbers of fighters and the number of fighters that show up to wars and participate in wars, and statistics like that, I think everybody would like to see more, but that's going to come from the generation that's now doing it, kind of figuring out a way to attract and bring in more members. And I do think diversity is a big part of that. I do think our group needs to work on that a lot. And that's just something I think we're dealing with, more broadly right now, but there's some things that could be done and need to be done to continue to seek other ways of gaining people joining and participating, and that will continue to make us better.
Do you have your sword with you, your killing tool?
I don't.
Okay. You don't have to go get it. If you could just sort of explain how you put it together, that would be great.
Oh, I have gone from, and lengthwise, I've gone from using a 38-inch blade to using about a 34-inch blade. And that's an age thing. That's as I've gotten older and as I've adjusted a few things, I've brought it down to a slightly lower length. The way I actually construct it is I will usually shave the edges of it. I will then wrap it in one layer of tape, and I actually use electrical tape, black electrical tape. And the reason I use it is electrical tape actually, once you put it on the stick, it adds a tinge of weight to it. It's just a small amount, but I just like the way that it feels. I tend to reinforce the sweet spot, usually crisscrossing about 1/3 down the blade with masking tape. And then I also, one of the things that I do is I hit about 1 foot off of the pommel. So right in front of my foregrip, I actually deliver a lot of killing blows about 12 inches on the face of that sword. And that's with stuff that I do on inside work. So that's another part that I'm generally looking to reinforce a little bit on the stick.
So you like that right cross snap, like into the face?
It's either directly or off of a combination. But yeah, I found it's probably the most powerful blow I can throw if I can execute it correctly I catch it about that far up the stick, and it's usually something you can drive.
And do you prefer a metal basket hilt or a plastic basket hilt?
I use a stainless steel metal basket hilt.
And a trigger or a lanyard?
I technically I don't use either. I have a lanyard that holds the sword to meet the minimums of the requirement. I use grip tape on my sword, and I use so much grip tape on my sword, very oftentimes my glove is stuck to the sword handle. So, so I have a little finger lanyard that is there to meet the specification and the rule. But the reality is my sword's not coming out of my hand. My hand's stuck to the sword.
That's cool. We had, I can't even remember who it was, but we had someone on the other day who actually has their gauntlet tied to their basket hilt, like it through, and I'm just like, that's brilliant.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to, that'd be a good way to do it as well. This is kind of effectively the same thing, but yeah.
And we could probably talk to you for like hours about your experiences, but Kellen, do you have any other questions you want to ask him before I go to the last 10?
No, I think
I'm a little over.
Because I'm pretty sure whatever I'd ask, I'd want to ask follow up. So
okay, all right. Then we're gonna go to the final 10. You ready?
Okay, I'm ready.
If you could fight anyone in the world, who would it be?
In the SCA or anyone in the world?
Anyone in the world.
Living or dead?
Doesn't matter.
anyone.
I think I would ultimately love to fight William Marshall.
Who would you like to see reign in your kingdom?
Who would I like to see reign in my kingdom? You know, I'm going to answer this in a different way. I would like to see people reign in our kingdom that have a true joy at being the crown for the kingdom and give it their all, and do it with love. Do it with love, because it is a job. It's a great job, but it is a job. And it is something that can, you know, be racking on relationships, and can be, you know, can be not so fun at times. And make sure you got some passion. But I'd say, yeah, I as individuals go, I think that could be anybody. But have the passion, and then be willing to put on the show.
All right. If you could talk stick with anyone in the world for an hour, who would it be?
I like jibber jabbering with Sean, and it's just because Sean is so, as you all know, I mean, he's just passionate, and I'm admittedly a little less passionate at this point in my career. You know, I enjoyed it, and I don't do it very much anymore. I enjoyed it a lot over the years, but he's just passionate right now, and I think that's great. And you know, reminds me a little bit of a younger me.
That's probably the best compliment you could give him. And, you know, kudos to you for taking a 14-year-old under your wing and, you know, pointing him in the right direction and giving him all that tutelage, because a lot of people wouldn't do that. So I think that's pretty special. Anyway.
He used to swear a lot when he got hit.
What is your favorite medieval-esque or period movie?
Favorite movie?
It can be fantasy or whatever.
You know, I'd say Robin and Marion.
If you could add a rule to the rules of the list, what would it be?
A rule to the rules of the list. Um, you know, one thing I do take very seriously is make sure the circumference of your helm actually protects yourself from getting a concussion. I do believe that a lot of fighters have actually, knowingly or unknowingly, hurt themselves or others by virtue of the fact that I see so many helmets that are grossly underpadded, and you know, having knocked out a few folks over the years, some of that was due to potentially not having the right amount of padding. We should be able to throw really good, hard blows and have a great time and not cause somebody, you know, lifetime damage.
And there's so many good products now too. There's just really there's no excuse for not having good padding.
It's just getting a helmet that's big enough.
Yeah. What is your favorite tournament format?
I'd say I like single fight double limbs. I think they bring into play the single fight, meaning, you know, live or die, and double limb, you get a chance at retrieval. But I do think that that's as speed of tournaments go, and also as keeping fighters. I've seen a lot of sloppy tournaments where the fight's been set up to where fighters don't have the stamina or the ability to keep up with what the tournament format was. And, you know, you could blame that on, well, the fighters aren't in good enough shape, or they haven't put enough effort in, or whatever. I've just seen too many of them get really, really sloppy toward the end. And I would say part of that is the style of the list that's being fought. So you kind of get what you ask for. Some of these other styles keep it a little crisper to the end, which is, you know, I think at the end of the fight, you want the best fight that's going to happen. So.
Agreed. What is your favorite event?
Favorite event? You know, I'll answer that one this way. My favorite event is Crown Tournament if I'm fighting in it.
It's always more fun if you're fighting.
And it's one of my least favorite events if I'm not fighting in it.
Super hard to watch, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you could have any helmet, regardless of cost, what kind would it be?
Oh, I've always Gothic Soleil. To me, I think is about as classy and as nice a suit as you could get, and that it's not as practical, but it, you know, for what it was made for, it is that's probably my favorite.
Yeah, they have some pretty sexy lines, those helmets. Anyway, it's Saturday morning at Estrella, and several people want to talk to you about last night. What did you do?
Oh, you don't want to know. These days, I probably went to bed. Now, I many memories of some very late and painful nights.
He looks back at Anna. That's cute. All right.
Shout out to Trelon if he's out there. He'll know what I'm talking about. And Michael as well.
Who is your favorite fight ever?
My favorite fight. That's a hard one to answer, to be perfectly honest with you. That's really, really hard. I've had just over the years, some really, really fun fights with a lot of people. You know, Branos and Michael and Trelawn and Lucan and Gregor. And just keep going down the names. And Jade back in the day. I would probably say in most recent times, I've had some fun fights with Gregor that are just fun. Stefan von Dresden, I will tell you that to me, Stefan von Dresden is just a fun fight.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time and telling us all about everything. We really appreciated having you. Thank you to Kelwin for co-hosting with me tonight. I appreciate it. And thanks everyone for joining us. So
Thank you.
thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.